Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the gospel of Jesus Christ, the testimony of the biblical prophets, current events, the intersection of all of these things and how they relate to you and me. Now, on last week's program, we took some time just to lay the groundwork for what is unfolding, this really dramatic shift in the Middle East, which is Russian troops on Syrian soil. And specifically, we laid the groundwork for how we got to where we are today and what does it mean in terms of biblical prophecy. Now, what I essentially laid out is that a lot of people, because of Russian involvement in the Middle East, everybody is naturally going to be asking, is this Ezekiel 38:39? Is this the beginning of the battle of Gog and Magog? And I've already seen a few articles online on some of the biblical prophecy-oriented websites, asking this question, saying this is probably the beginning. And what I said is that no, when we look at the biblical text, this is not Ezekiel 38:39. Rather, it is in all likelihood the beginnings of it is the beginnings of the fulfillment of the first war, the Iranian invasion of the Middle East as described in Daniel chapter 8. And we'll get to Daniel chapter 8, but before we do that, I want to take some time to walk through Ezekiel 38 and 39. So what I did in last week, we said there's three primary, very popular, wrong beliefs that are associated with the oracle of Ezekiel 38:39. The first, very popular, very common, but I would argue unbiblical belief is that Gog is Russia, that the Battle of Gog of Magog is primarily described in the Scriptures as a Russian-led invasion of the Middle East. I don't believe that aligns with a careful examination of the text. Secondly, many people believe that Gog and the Antichrist are two different individuals. I think the Scriptures are clear that Gog is the Antichrist, that Gog is just another name for the Antichrist. In fact, it's probably the most significant name used for him in the Old Testament, other than Daniel 11's the King of the North or the Little Horn. But this is one of the most important titles used for the Antichrist in the Old Testament. And then the third popular misunderstanding of the Scriptures has led many people to believe that as a result of the Battle of Gog-Magog, Islam is about to be wiped out. It's about to go away. The reason that I emphasize that this is such a critical issue to deconstruct, to debunk really, is because if we believe that, we are not going to rise to meet what is arguably the single greatest challenge that the church will face globally before the return of Jesus. Listen, guys, this has tremendous application. This has tremendous implications in terms of praxis, in terms of the church actually doing what we're supposed to be doing. This is not just discussing Bible prophecy for the sake of trivia and gaining insight into understanding. This is an issue of application. If we say God's about to wipe out the entire Islamic world, we're not going to rise to meet the challenge. We're not going to be sending missionaries. We're not going to be pouring our resources into the Islamic world. We're just going to sit back and passively let God wipe the whole Middle East out, so to speak. And I think that is a tremendously naive, irresponsible interpretation. And I don't think it can be substantiated based on the text. So let's go ahead and just begin by looking at Ezekiel 38 and 39. The first issue that I want to work through of these three popular misconceptions is this idea that Gog, the leader of this coalition, is specifically from Russia. Now, you've had This is, again, a widely held belief. You've had some prophecy teachers that have all but pretty much come right out and said that Putin is Gog. That Vladimir Putin himself, not just Russia in a general sense, but that he himself is Gog that is prophesied in the Scriptures. So let's just begin by looking at the names that are listed, the regions, the tribes, the peoples that are listed in this particular oracle, and then we'll break down exactly what they mean. So first of all, as we've already said, you have Gog. Now, Gog is the leader. Gog is from Magog. Virtually any commentary that you'll read will say Gog is the leader of the coalition, and he is from Magog, which is the land of Gog. Magog is simply the land of Gog, and Gog is from Magog. So if we can identify where Magog is, then we can identify where the leader of this coming coalition is, and thus we can identify the primary leader of this coalition, of this invasion. Okay, so we have Gog of Magog. Then beyond that, we have Meshech, we have Tubal, we have Persia, we have Cush, we have Put, we have Gomer, and then we have Togarmah, or Beth Togarmah, the house of Togarmah. Now, here's the thing with this, is people often list these several nations, these several peoples, but then they fail to take into consideration this very important statement, which says, and many troops with you. So it's important to recognize that this list of nations is not comprehensive. It's not telling us every single people or nation that's going to be involved. It says many peoples will be with you. These are just listing, again, the primary, most important key players in the invasion, but we need to realize that many others will be involved in the battle of Gog-Magog. So those are the primary nations. Now here's the thing. When we come to interpret these names, and this is a key point that I want you to follow, and this is something that everyone needs to get, is that there are two primary methods of reading these names and then understanding what they mean. Now, the first method we would call the grammatical historical method. And through the grammatical historical method, this is actually very simple. It's the idea that Ezekiel and his immediate audience would have understood these names to refer to particular peoples in their day. So we look at the original context. We go, how would Ezekiel have understood these names? How would his immediate audience have understood those names? And then we correlate those ancient peoples to modern day regions. Okay, so that's just a very simple, we're just taking it at face value according to its original context and correlating it to the regions that it points to today. So, Ezekiel wasn't going to use the name Turkey. Ezekiel wasn't going to use the name Iran. Rather, Ezekiel used the names of the peoples that he understood in his day that lived in these particular parts of the world. So he didn't use the modern names, he used the regions. So there's a regional correlation to the ancient names. Now I've thrown in here a quote from Gleason Archer, a legendary biblical scholar, and he argues this is the approach to take. Most responsible evangelical commentators and scholars are going to take this approach. This is, if you read through the commentaries that are, again, trained evangelicals, this is the approach they're going to take. And so here's a quote from Gleason Archer. He says, likewise, the ancient names of countries or states occupying the region where the final conflict will be carried on are used in the prediction. Though most of these political units will no longer bear these names in the last days. Thus, he says, Edom, Moab, Ammon, Assyria, Babylon, which are mentioned in eschatological passages, and we could list, dozens of others, including all of those that we just listed, Gog, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, etc. He says, those names have long since ceased to exist as political entities, their places having been taken by later peoples occupying their territories. So again, Archer lays out his championing of that particular method of interpreting these names. In my book, Mideast Beast, I also cite Dr. Tommy Ice, who also argues for that perspective. Again, anyone who is a well-trained evangelical scholar is going to take that approach. Now, the other method of interpreting and trying to identify these names, this is something that I jokingly refer to, this method. I call it the bloodline, lineage, intermarriage, historical migration, wild goose chase approach. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Well, very simple. And this is what, you'll see this in a lot of the more popular prophecy books. And, you know, for all clarity, I put myself in that category. I am not a thoroughly trained scholar. Sometimes I've been given that title, but I'm not a carefully trained scholar by any stretch. I'm simply someone who's doing my best to look to the commentaries, draw out the meaning, again, look at history, and just in a very careful, responsible way lay this stuff out. But when you look at a lot of these popular prophecy books, again, not the more scholarly commentaries, you see people taking this bloodline, lineage, intermarriage, migration, wild goose chase. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is where you take, for instance, the name Magog. And you say, well, Magog in Ezekiel's day, yes, that would have been in Turkey or in Asia Minor. But after Ezekiel's day, the Magogites, they became the Scythian peoples, and they migrated out of Turkey, out around the Black Sea, out through Romania and Moldova and Ukraine, up into Russia, and then they spread across the Russian steppes, and then maybe some Scandinavians came down and they intermarried. And so essentially, when I say the wild goose chase, what I mean is you have to pull out all of these historical texts, work through the bloodline, the intermarriage, tracing these particular ancient peoples. And we're going back to the beginning of the Table of Nations in Genesis. We're going back to thousands of years ago and trying to trace them down through history. Now, that's not impossible, but it becomes very difficult, and it's filled with numerous points where history loses the details of every single people. And we don't know. We can only go to some of these very ancient historical texts to try to work through these things. So in a lot of ways, some of it becomes speculation. Some of it's fairly solid, but you end up, the history of the world is the history of the intermarriage, the intermingling, the migration of so many different peoples. And so it becomes difficult to nail this stuff down with any absolute clarity. Nevertheless, when you look at a lot of these popular prophecy books, this is what they do. They emphasize this historical wild goose chase sort of approach. But here's the thing, and this is critical, and please hear me on this. I've walked through and very carefully, systematically analyzed how several of the most popular, well-known prophecy teachers out there work through these texts. And most often what they do is they switch back and forth from one method to the other, depending on which name they're interpreting. So often, because so many of these guys have tried to say that the Ezekiel 38 and 39 is talking about Russia, when it comes to Magog, again, Gog is from Magog. So if we can show that Magog is Russia, then we've just established that Gog is the leader from Russia, right? Thus fulfilling this popular idea that Putin is Gog. So what they'll do is they'll use the bloodline historical migration intermarriage method. They'll point out that Josephus, for instance, mentioned that Magog became the Scythian peoples. Then they trace the Scythian peoples up to Russia, and they say Magog is from Russia. Okay, so they use that method. Excuse me. They use that method there. But then when they get to the other names, they switch methods. Why? Why do they switch methods? Because if you're not using a consistent method each time, it's like a card trick. It becomes like a parlor trick. And I'm not picking on anyone saying they do that on purpose, but it really is kind of a deception. We need to choose a method and stick to it and be consistent. If you want to use the bloodline lineage migration with Magog, you have to do it with all of the names in the prophecy. And then you have to stick with the results, regardless as to where they lead. You can't just say, well, in our day, it seems like Russia's the big bad guy. They're the big atheist, anti-God entity. That's been the position, for the past few generations. Now it's interesting. They're sort of turning back to sort of a Russian Orthodox sort of Russian Orthodox nationalistic approach to things. But before that, it was Russia, the great atheist nation. Thus people, all these Western, American particularly, prophecy teachers, they would read Russia into the text and try to cast Russia as the leader of this evil end-time coalition that's going to get wiped out. But again, they would not do so by using a consistent methodology. So what happens if you do use a consistent methodology? This is interesting. Now with Magog, again, who did Magog become? If we do the wild goose chase, if we do the historical method, the Magog peoples became peoples from the following nations: Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Chechnya, Dagestan, Hungary, Finland, Estonia, Siberia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, Slovenia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Turkey, Uzbekistan. Then you get over to the Central Asian, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Georgia, Scotland, and even a few others. So here's the thing is, even if you use this sort of bloodline lineage thing, it doesn't just point to Russia. It points to many, many, many different nations. But again, that's not very popular. It's not very popular to say the coming Czech Republic invasion of Israel, the coming Scottish invasion of Israel. So what people have done is they've focused on Russia. Well, what else? Because again, if we use that method, we need to be consistent. What about Tubal? What if we do the wild historical goose chase with Tubal? Well, the Tubal people, they became the people today that make up Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, as well as Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Spain, Portugal, Mexico, South America. Okay, now if you were to write a book today that says the coming South American invasion of Israel, that's not really going to make a lot of sense. People aren't going to buy that, right? So people instead focus on Russia. But so this is what they do, is they'll somehow use this selective method by interpreting the names to point to Russia. But then when they get to Tubal, when they get to Meshech, when they get to Gomer, they switch to the grammatical historical method. And usually, most books today, or at least in the past, let's say 15 years, would say that Tubal is pointing to Turkey. They stick with the more responsible method for interpreting Tubal, but they switch when it comes to Magog. Now, even Dr. Thomas Ice, who, in my analysis, Dr. Ice is one of the most responsible interpreters, and I had the chance to debate him on Up for Debate Radio a few months ago, and we discussed this issue. And, you know, he said on the radio, he said, listen, he said, I come to the conclusion that Russia is the leader of this, not through any bloodline, genetic interpretation, he said, but strictly through grammatical means. And so I said, well, that would be wonderful if that was the case. But from his own website, from his own article, which I've worked through in great detail, the specific quote that he uses to conclude that that Rosh, one of the names in the list, is pointing to Russia. Here's his quote to defend that. He says, the ancient Rosh people, who have been traced back to Tiras, a son of Japheth, who migrated to the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia, are one of the genetic sources of the modern Russians of today. So again, with all of the other names, Ice uses the grammatical historical method. With Rosh, suddenly he's talking about tracing bloodline, he's talking about tracing migration patterns, and he's talking about genetic sources. So do you see how he switches methodologies in order to stick to the popular yet unbiblical conclusion that Gog is from Russia? If Dr. Ice was consistent with his interpretation of Rosh, then he would conclude that Tiras became the Thracians, and it points to basically Italy and the Greeks, and perhaps it could include some peoples from Russia, but he would have to include all of those other names, which no one does. Dr. Ice doesn't do it, no one does it. So again, I've kind of laid out for you the different methods and how people have basically pulled the wool over the eyes of so much of the church. And so many people in the prophecy community today are absolutely convinced this is pointing to Russia. But if we stick with the simple historical grammatical method and we're consistent and we're responsible, then where do we end up? Then where do we end up? And so let's just look at this. I'm going to just begin with the New Moody Atlas of the Bible. The New Moody Atlas of the Bible, and I've thrown up some images here. Now for clarity, I artistically modified these just to make sure that I'm not violating copyright, but I want to put these up here so that you can see them. If you're to go to the New Moody Atlas of the Bible, you'll see that I've accurately represented exactly what they have in terms of the locations, but I've changed it visually. Again, I just don't want to violate copyright. But you look at the New Moody Atlas of the Bible, you have Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah. Where are they? They are in Asia Minor. That's modern-day Turkey. Okay, that's not Russia. Magog is squarely placed in Asia Minor. Why? Because in Ezekiel's day, they would have been in Asia Minor. Back in Ezekiel's day, going all the way back. And Ezekiel's worldview, by the way, would have been informed by the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and 11. So when you say, how would a biblically literate Jew of Ezekiel's day have understood these? Their worldview would have been based on the Table of Nations. And so based on the Table of Nations and the worldview of that particular day, Magog and really 5 out of the 8 or arguably 9 names listed are all in Turkey. What else? Well, we've got the Zondervan Atlas of the Bible. Again, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, all where? Modern-day Turkey. It's not in Russia, it's in Turkey. What else? Well, the Holman Bible Atlas, again, validates the exact same locations. We've got the IVP Atlas of the Bible. Once again, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah, all in Asia Minor, Turkey. Okay? Why is it that the Bible atlases, the conservative, responsible Bible atlases, place them all in Turkey? Because they don't have some prophetic bone to pick. They're not trying to make some point. They're not trying to validate their particular teacher that came before them. They're simply looking at the locations as history reveals it. And it points to Turkey over and over and over again. Now, when we look at what's unfolding in the Middle East, right now you have Russia that has joined with Syria and Iran. Now, clearly Persia, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, that's Iran is Persia. Clearly Persia is part of the Ezekiel coalition. And so people go, well, Russia, Iran, they've always been taught that Russia's part of it. And so they see Russia siding with Iran. They say this is it. The problem is that Turkey is fundamentally opposed to what Russia and Iran and Syria are doing. In fact, the past few years, all evidence points to the fact that there has been a war unfolding between Turkey and Iran in the region, that ISIS has largely been doing the dirty work for Turkey, and that ISIS has basically been Turkey's proxy. It's been Turkey's junkyard dog in the region, as Turkey has been waging a war against Assad, who is again an Alawite, who is beholden to Iran, against the Kurds in the north, because the Turks are always opposed to the Kurds because the Kurds want to take a big part of Turkey for their own autonomous nation, as well as Turkey's war against Iran. Again, because Iran wants to control much of the Middle East. Turkey wants to control much of the Middle East. Iran wants to control much of the Middle East. And so whereas Turkey has been using ISIS, again, once more for clarity, against Assad, against the Kurds, and against Iran, Iran has been using Assad as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon in its larger regional proxy war to control the region. So listen, Russia is siding with Iran, but notice that this is not primarily a Turkish-led coalition. No, this is fundamentally conflicting with Turkish interests. Now, Turkey may do some things to sort of make it look like they're going along with it, but believe me, right now the AKP party, the government in Turkey, is freaking out because this is a major game changer. Russia is siding with Iran. Russia, by the way, is attacking American-backed troops in Syria. This is putting the conflict that is developing right now is tremendous. You have American bombers and Russian bombers flying in the same airspace. What if Israel wants to interject and do something against Assad or against Iran? Well, suddenly now they're doing it against Russia. What if the United States accidentally hits some Russian troops? What if Israel acts in the region and actually takes out some Russian troops? What will this lead to?
For this week's program, we are offering What Comes Next in the Middle East Bundle. This important resource bundle includes the following powerful 6 resources. Joel's newest teaching DVD, What Comes Next in the Middle East. This 3-session teaching DVD examines the 2 critical passages of Daniel chapter 8 and Isaiah 19. Understanding what is happening right now in the Middle East and what may be next on the prophetic horizon. Second, you will receive the documentary film Better Friends Than Mountains, a film about ISIS, the Kurdish people, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. This beautifully made film will inspire and move you to learn what the Lord is doing right now in one of the world's most active crisis zones. Finally, you will receive 4 copies of Dear Muslim Friend. This highly recommended book answers all of the primary objections to biblical faith commonly brought up by Muslims. Not only is this a critical book for all Christians, but it was specifically created to give away to Muslims. Together, these items are valued at over $60. But when you purchase all 6 items at the discounted rate of only $50, you help support this ministry. Go to joelstrumpet.com and order the What Comes Next in the Middle East bundle.
So again, we've just begun to work through Ezekiel 38. We've begun to address this key issue. Who are the peoples involved? Is it Russia or is it Turkey? And again, the emphasis of the prophecy is a Turkish-led coalition, not a Russian-led coalition. But then you say, well, wait a minute, Joel. How is it that Iran, if Turkey and Iran are opposed to each other, how is it that Iran will come under Turkey? And this is where I believe Daniel 8 reveals that Iran is going to be defeated by Turkey. Before we even get to Ezekiel 38, Turkey is going to defeat Persia. And so this is going to be a major event that needs to take place, some major wars that need to take place before we get to Ezekiel 38. So we've just begun to really address some of the main interpretive issues, to reveal why what's happening right now is not Gog Magog. It's a preliminary, it's leading up to it. Next week when we come back, we're going to look at the text some more to examine why, it's just some more of the reasons why this is not Ezekiel 38, 39, and to explain what is about to happen next in the Middle East. So that's all the time that we have for this week. I want to thank you for being with us. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.